Now, in this video, we will understand what Pi interface is and its important components. Then we will go ahead and install the Pi interface configuration utility and Pi interface for OPC-DA. And finally, we will briefly discuss the general steps to fully install and configure any Pi interface. There are about 400 plus Pi interfaces that can gather data from different kinds of data sources. In general, Pi interface is nothing but a program that runs on a specific node, and it needs to be configured to communicate and gather data from the data source and send the data to the Pi data archive. In general, the Pi interfaces contain two different components, namely the associated executable file, this one, that runs the Pi interface, and the executable uses the so-called batch file. The batch file contains specific information the program actually requires for its operation, such as the name of the data source and its node name of the Pi data archive to send the data to, and other configuration information. Finally, in order to configure the Pi interface, we require another application, which is called Pi Interface Configuration Utility, Pi ICU in short. This application comes along with two different kinds of applications, namely the Pi SDK and Pi API, which are two possible connection mechanisms that can be utilized to establish communication with the Pi data archive. In general, we perform the following steps to install and configure any Pi interface. We need to run the install kits to install the Pi ICU, which stands for Pi Interface Configuration Utility, and Pi interface. In this case, we installed Pi interface for OPC-DA. Then we set up the necessary security, namely Pi trust. We will perform some pre-configuration checks. Then we will configure the Pi interface instance using the batch file through the ICU and verify the startup process, wherein we need to run it interactively. Then we create the Windows service for the Pi interface for OPC-DA. Then we create the necessary Pi points, and finally we configure the buffering. Now let's run the installation kits for installing Pi interface configuration utility and Pi interface for OPC-DA. At the outset, we would like to mention that if possible, you should install the components on a separate drive so that C drive will be reserved for the operating system. But in this case, let's go ahead and install the components under the C drive itself, since we do not have any other drive. To do this, first let's go to our designated Pi interface node, which is Pi int1. Here you will see a folder on the desktop called course folder. Open up the course folder, open up the install kits folder. Here you will find the two components, namely the Pi interface configuration utility and Pi interface for OPC-DA. First, let's install Pi ICU, which stands for interface configuration utility. Right click, say run as administrator, and here I can say /Pi ICU. By this, I'm just creating a subfolder and say OK. Now it's basically scanning your machine to find out what component needs to be installed and what components needs to be upgraded. So this is our audit report, and it basically says all these components are going to be installed. Let's accept the default and say OK. Let's keep the default and say next. Let's enter the name of our Pi data archive, which is Pi srv1. Click next. Click next. And let's see the audit report, and everything is installed. Good. You can close this dialog box. Now let's go ahead and install the Pi interface for OPCDA. Again, right click this application, enter /. I can name it as OPC int underscore 2.5.1.3. So it's going to install these components. So let's acknowledge, say OK, click next, next. We can accept the defaults, click next. It's auto populated with the path to install the components. Click next, install. Next, 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 install. Say finish. Good. So this is completely installed. So with this, we have installed the Pi interface configuration utility and Pi interface for OPCDA. Now that we have installed the necessary components on the designated Pi interface node, namely PyInt1, let's navigate to the installation folder location. So let's go to C, Program Files x86, PyPC, Interfaces, OPCInt. As discussed at the beginning of the video, we have the two important components, namely the executable file and the associated batch file. This is a sample batch file which is provided, and this can be utilized to configure the instance of Pi interface for OPCDA. We would also note that the documentation associated with this version of Pi interface for OPCDA is also available for your reference as well. In this video, we discussed what Pi interface is and its important components. Then we installed the Pi interface configuration utility and Pi interface for OPCDA. And finally, we understood the general steps to follow to fully install and configure any Pi interface.